a frozen night of survival. The Apache woman who saved a stranger. Ahuli had always felt at home in the mountains. To anyone else, the snow-covered peaks of northern Arizona might seem harsh, cold, and unforgiving. But to her, the land was alive. The crunch of snow beneath her boots, the whisper of the wind through the pines, the faint tracks of deer and rabbit, all of it spoke a language she had learned since she was a child. Her grandmother had taught her to listen to the land, to understand its moods and signs, and Ahuli had never forgotten. She knew the mountains could be both beautiful and dangerous, and respect for them was the first rule of survival. The day had started like any other winter day. The sun had barely risen, casting pale gold light over the snow, turning the peaks into a glowing canvas. Ahuli wrapped her thick woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders and stepped outside her small wooden cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, hinting at the warmth inside, but she had work to do. The storm that had been forecasted for the night would arrive soon, and she had to prepare. She needed firewood, and her traps had to be checked. Food would not wait, and the mountains would not forgive hesitation. She breathed in the crisp, cold air, letting it fill her lungs, and started down the familiar trail that led to the forest. Ahuli's boots made soft imprints in the fresh snow as she moved carefully. She scanned the ground with trained eyes, noting every mark, every change. She paused near a cluster of juniper trees, examining her traps. A small rabbit had been caught, and she gently freed it, murmuring an apology before letting it go. It was a practice she had learned from her people. Take only what was needed and show respect for all living things. She reset the traps, using careful hands that knew the difference between a dangerous mistake and a simple oversight. The mountains were quiet at first, only the wind whispering through the trees. But as she moved further along the trail, Ahuli noticed something unusual: tracks in the snow. At first, she thought they might belong to a deer, or maybe a coyote, but the pattern was wrong. Too upright, too deliberate. Her heart quickened. Human footprints, and not just any human footprints. They were new, fresh, and they led toward the more dangerous, steep parts of the mountains. A cold shiver ran down her spine, not from the snow, but from concern. Someone was out there, alone, and they were walking straight into the storm. Ahuli's mind worked quickly. She knew the dangers of winter in the mountains: frostbite, hypothermia, getting lost. People unfamiliar with the land could not survive long if a storm arrived. She had to find this person before it was too late. She followed the footprints cautiously, moving silently, as though the snow itself were listening. Her eyes darted from tree to tree, her ears tuned to the slightest snap of a branch. Every instinct she had learned over years of living in these mountains was now on high alert. As she moved, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were light at first, almost playful, swirling around the trees. But the wind was picking up, and Ahuli knew it would not stay gentle for long. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, pulling the hood over her head, and pressed on. She moved swiftly but carefully, making sure not to lose the tracks she was following. With each step, the snow grew deeper, sometimes reaching her ankles, sometimes higher. Her breath came out in white puffs, and the cold began to bite at her fingers, but she ignored it. She could not afford to stop. Time was critical. Hours seemed to pass in silence. The mountains, normally a place of beauty and peace, now seemed more mysterious, almost threatening. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with snow. The wind howled around the rocks, creating sounds that could confuse even the most experienced tracker. But Ahuli moved steadily, guided by the footprints and her intuition. She had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about people lost in storms, stories of survival and tragedy. She did not want to add another story like that to the mountains. She would find this person. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the snow, Ahuli saw something unusual ahead. A faint shape, partially covered by snow, lay near a rock formation. Her heart raced. She quickened her pace, carefully stepping over hidden patches of ice. As she drew closer, she realized it was a man. He was lying face down, his body trembling violently. Snow clung to his clothes and hair, and his breathing was shallow. He was clearly exhausted and losing the battle against the cold. Ahuli felt a wave of urgency. She had to act fast. She knelt beside him, gently shaking his shoulder. "Hey," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "You need help." The man groaned, barely lifting his head, confusion and fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but could only manage a few weak sounds. Ahuli quickly assessed his condition. His skin was pale, his lips blue. He was in danger. Hypothermia was setting in, and the storm was approaching fast. She could feel the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but there was no time to hesitate. She would not leave him here. Not tonight. Not ever. Ahuli reached into her pack and pulled out a thick blanket. She wrapped it around him, then lifted him carefully to his feet. He swayed, barely able to stand, but she supported him. Step by step, she guided him toward a small, hidden cave she knew nearby. It was a place she had used herself on harsh nights, a natural shelter against wind and snow. The journey was slow and exhausting, each step requiring all of her strength and balance. The snowstorm was starting to rage and the cold was relentless, but Ahuli did not falter. She whispered words of encouragement, though she knew he might not understand them. She had to keep him moving, keep him alive. By the time they reached the cave, the sky had darkened, and snow fell in thick sheets. Ahuli quickly built a fire from dry bark and branches she had collected earlier. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls of the cave, creating a small oasis of warmth in the cold wilderness. She guided the man to sit close to the fire, rubbing his hands together to restore circulation. Her own body ached from the exertion, but she ignored it. Survival, she knew, was more than just keeping warm. It was about staying calm, staying focused, and never giving up. As the man slowly began to regain consciousness, Ahuli watched him carefully. His eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting to the dim light, and recognition slowly replaced confusion. He was alive, for now. But she knew the night was far from over. The storm outside was still growing, and the man was weak and vulnerable. Ahuli settled herself near the fire, ready to spend the night tending to him. She would keep him awake, keep him warm, and make sure he survived until morning. This was what it meant to truly care, to use knowledge, courage, and instinct to save a life. The wind howled outside, rattling the cave walls, but inside, Ahuli felt a quiet determination. She had faced many challenges in her life, but helping another human being survive in such conditions tested her in ways that went beyond skill. It was about heart, patience, and resilience. She had the land on her side, the knowledge passed down from generations, and the strength of her own will. Tonight, that strength would be tested, and Ahuli was ready. Hours stretched into night. The fire crackled, snow swirled around the entrance of the cave, and the man slowly began to respond to her care. He was frightened, but Ahuli's calm presence reassured him. She spoke softly, in her gentle, steady voice. telling him to breathe, to stay awake, to trust her. The man's eyes, once glazed with despair, now reflected a flicker of hope. And for Ahuli, that was enough. Hope was the first step toward survival. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, the cave became a place of quiet determination and fragile warmth. Ahuli kept watch, knowing that the night would be long and that the man's life depended on every careful choice she made. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived harsh winters with nothing but knowledge and courage. She thought of the mountains, which could be harsh teachers but loyal friends to those who respected them. And she thought of the man whose life was now intertwined with hers for this frozen night of survival. The storm outside showed no mercy. Snow fell in thick sheets, driven by gusts of wind that shook the walls of the cave and rattled loose branches outside. Each sound reminded Ahuli of the danger the stranger faced. His body was weak, his lips a pale blue, and every breath he took seemed shallow and strained. She had never seen a human body surrender so quickly to the cold. It was terrifying, but she could not panic. Panic was useless here. Only calmness and careful action could save him. Ahuli moved quickly, but deliberately. She had already wrapped the man in a thick blanket and guided him close to the fire, but she knew that more needed to be done. She removed her own gloves and carefully rubbed his hands and feet, massaging them to restore blood circulation. She spoke softly, telling him to stay awake, to keep talking to her, to fight the cold. At first, he could barely respond, only a faint whisper or a slight movement of his head, but she encouraged every small sign of life, treating it as a victory. The storm continued to howl outside, as though the mountains themselves were testing them. Each gust of wind sent icy air seeping into the cave, chilling them both. Ahuli quickly adjusted the fire, adding more dry bark and twigs to increase the warmth. She blew gently across the flames to help them catch and rise higher. Sparks danced along the rocks, casting flickering light on the walls of the cave. It was a small, fragile warmth against the fury of the blizzard, but it was enough to keep the man from slipping further into unconsciousness. As she worked, Ahuli began to notice the details of the stranger's clothing. He was not prepared for a winter storm. His coat was thin, not insulated enough to withstand such freezing temperatures. His shoes were wet and not designed for deep snow. His hat had long since blown away in the wind, leaving his head exposed. He was lucky, she thought, that she had found him when she did. A few more hours in the storm and he might have succumbed completely to the cold. The realization made her heart tighten. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but they were merciless. And tonight, mercy was something they had to fight for. Ahuli kept her eyes on him, watching every movement, every flicker of consciousness. She knew the danger of hypothermia. The body, she thought, could seem to recover, only to collapse again if not carefully monitored. He needed warmth, hydration, and constant attention. She melted snow in a small pot she had in her pack, carefully bringing it to a safe temperature and giving him tiny sips. He coughed weakly, shivering violently, but he drank. Encouraging him, she told him to keep moving his fingers and toes, to stay aware of the sensation in his body. It was exhausting, but she refused to let him give up. The man tried to speak, but his voice was weak, hoarse from the cold. I didn't expect it to snow like this, he muttered. His teeth chattered, and Ahuli gently pressed her gloved hand against his shoulder to steady him. You're here now, she said softly, and I'm not leaving. You'll be okay. Just stay awake, keep your eyes open, and trust me. Her voice had a calm authority born from years of survival in these mountains. He seemed to relax slightly, leaning on her presence even when his body refused to cooperate. Hours passed slowly. The fire crackled, sending shadows across the walls of the cave, while outside the storm roared with increasing intensity. Ahuli never left his side. She fed him sips of water, checked his extremities, and adjusted the blanket to trap as much heat as possible. Every so often she would whisper encouragements, small words of hope. "You're stronger than you think. You're going to make it through the night." Her words, though simple, carried power. They reminded him that he was not alone, that someone was fighting for his survival. As the night grew deeper, Ahuli noticed his condition slowly improving. His shivering became less violent, his breathing steadied, and the faint color returned to his lips. The small victories gave her courage, but she knew not to relax too soon. The storm was not over, and his strength was still fragile. One mistake, one misstep, could undo all their hard work. She felt a deep sense of responsibility. His life now rested in her hands, and she would not fail. Ahuli's mind raced with possibilities. The storm could last all night. The man could become unconscious again. She had to be prepared for every scenario. She thought of traditional remedies her grandmother had taught her, methods to stimulate the body and restore warmth. She rubbed certain points on his hands and wrists, techniques passed down through generations, and murmured old chants under her breath. She believed in the power of knowledge and intention. Survival was as much about spirit as it was about physical strength. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside, the wind howled in a relentless chorus, carrying snow and ice that battered the rocks surrounding the cave. Ahuli's eyes never left the man. She adjusted the fire again, blew on the flames to keep them alive, and shifted the blanket to cover more of his body. The man's lips quivered as he murmured incoherently, but his body was slowly responding to her care. She felt a glimmer of relief, but she reminded herself that relief was dangerous. Focus was their only ally tonight. At one point, the man's eyes fluttered open fully, and he stared at her with a mixture of fear, confusion, and gratitude. Who are you?" he asked weakly. Ahuli smiled faintly, brushing a strand of snow-damp hair from his face. "My name is Ahuli," she said softly. "I live in these mountains. I'm here to help you survive the night." That's all you need to know right now. She did not offer explanations about the forest, the storm, or how she had found him. Words could be confusing in a state like this. He needed warmth, safety, and reassurance. That was enough. The man's body was slowly recovering, but his mind was still foggy. He tried to stand at one point, wobbled dangerously, and Ahuli caught him immediately. "No," she said firmly but gently, guiding him back to the blanket and the fire. "You stay here. You rest. You recover. We'll move when it's safe." He seemed to understand, nodding weakly. She could feel his trust in her growing, a fragile connection forming in the middle of the storm. Hours passed, and gradually the storm began to lose some of its intensity. Snow still fell, but the wind's roar diminished slightly. Ahuli took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of victory. They were surviving. They were still alive. But she knew the night was not over, and the man's strength was still limited. She continued her vigil, checking his hands and feet, adjusting the blanket, and keeping the fire alive. Each small act of care mattered immensely. As she looked at the man, Ahuli reflected on the fragility of life in these mountains. A single storm, a single misstep, could mean death. She had seen it before, stories from her grandmother and the elders, tales of travelers lost to the cold. But tonight, she was the difference between life and death for this stranger. And she felt a quiet sense of purpose, a connection not only to him but to the land and to her ancestors who had survived these harsh winters with wisdom and courage. By the end of the night, the man's condition had improved significantly. He was no longer shivering violently, his breathing was steady, and he was able to sip water without difficulty. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now reflected faint hope. Ahuli allowed herself a small smile, though she remained vigilant. They had survived the first part of the storm together, but there was still more to do. The night was long, and she would not let her guard down until he was strong enough to leave the cave safely. Ahuli adjusted the fire one last time, settling herself beside the man. She whispered words of reassurance, telling him he was strong and brave. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also the satisfaction of knowing she was doing everything she could to keep him alive. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cave there was a fragile warmth, a flicker of hope, and a growing bond between two people who had met by chance in the harshest of conditions. The storm had not ended, but it had changed. The wind was still strong, and snow continued to fall in thick sheets, but there were moments when the blizzard seemed to pause, as if giving Ahuli a brief chance to breathe. She knew better than to relax. In these mountains, calm moments could be deceptive. The stranger she had found was still weak, his body fragile from hours of cold and exhaustion. Every breath he took was shallow, every movement careful. Ahuli watched him closely, knowing that the next few hours would be critical. She adjusted the blanket around him once more, making sure no part of his body was exposed to the cold air. His wet clothes had frozen in some areas, stiff and cold against his skin. She carefully removed the wet gloves he had worn and replaced them with thick, dry ones from her pack. She then took off his wet hat and replaced it with a woolen cap she had knitted herself. The little actions felt small, but each one made a difference. Every part of the body she could warm would improve his chances of survival. The man shivered violently again, his body still struggling to regain warmth. Ahuli rubbed his hands together, then his arms, using a method her grandmother had taught her. She pressed gently on certain points along his wrists and shoulders, and murmured the old Apache words that were meant to restore strength and encourage the body to fight the cold. It was not magic, she knew. It was knowledge, practice, and understanding of the human body combined with care. She had done this many times with her own family, with animals she had saved in the forest, and now with a complete stranger who had stumbled into her life. Hours into the night, the man's condition seemed to worsen unexpectedly. Ahuli noticed his breathing becoming erratic. His chest rose and fell in uneven movements, and his lips were turning a darker shade of blue. Fear tightened in her chest. She leaned closer, gently shaking his shoulder, whispering his name, "Stay with me. You can make it. Don't close your eyes. Keep fighting." He groaned, a sound of confusion mixed with pain. For a moment she thought he might slip away. Ahuli's mind raced, calculating every action carefully. The fire was still alive, but it was not enough to counteract the freezing temperatures seeping in from outside. She added more dry bark, blowing gently to strengthen the flames, and moved the man closer to the center of the warmth. She checked his hands and feet. They were numb, almost lifeless. She massaged them, rubbing the fingers and toes with steady pressure to restore circulation. She knew that if she could not restore warmth to his extremities, frostbite could set in, making the recovery far more difficult or even endangering his life. "Just stay awake," she whispered. "You're stronger than you think." Her voice was soft, steady, and full of determination. She held his hand firmly, feeling his fingers twitch slightly in response. It was a small victory, but in these moments, small victories were everything. The storm outside continued, but inside the cave there was a fragile sense of hope. She reminded herself not to let that hope become complacency. The night was far from over. Ahuli decided to make a small cup of hot water, warming it over the fire. She added a pinch of dried herbs she had collected earlier in the season, herbs known to help with warmth and energy. She carefully held the cup to his lips, guiding him to sip slowly. He coughed weakly, but managed to swallow. Each sip of warm liquid seemed to revive him slightly, restoring strength bit by bit. She encouraged him to continue drinking, telling him it would help his body fight the cold. He nodded faintly, too weak to speak, but following her instructions. As she tended to him, Ahuli thought about the mountains around them. She had lived here her entire life, and she knew the dangers well. People unfamiliar with the terrain could easily become lost, disoriented, or trapped by snow. She had grown up hearing stories of travelers who had wandered into the mountains, never to return. She understood that the stranger's situation could have ended much worse if she had not arrived when she did. The realization made her even more determined to save him. Tonight, her knowledge, her courage, and her patience would make the difference between life and death. Time moved slowly, the kind of slow that stretches every second into a long, tense moment. The storm outside seemed endless, but Ahuli stayed calm. She knew that any sign of panic could make the stranger feel hopeless. He needed her strength, her steady presence, and her focus. She whispered encouragements continuously, telling him stories of the forest, the animals, and the mountains in a way that was simple but comforting. Her words were meant to keep his mind awake, to keep him aware, and to prevent him from slipping into unconsciousness again. At one point, the stranger tried to move on his own, attempting to reach for the fire. Ahuli gently guided him back, holding him steady. "No," she said softly but firmly. "You must rest. You can only get stronger if you let your body heal. Trust me." He looked at her with wide eyes, the fog of fears slowly lifting. He nodded faintly, understanding her instructions, trusting her guidance. That trust was something she did not take lightly. It was fragile, and in these mountains, trust could be the difference between life and death. The hours continued, each one testing their endurance. Ahuli remained vigilant, checking his breathing, rubbing warmth into his body, and keeping the fire alive. Her hands ached, her arms were tired, and her eyes were strained from the dim light, but she refused to stop. Survival required sacrifice, and she was willing to give every ounce of energy she had to keep him alive. Each small improvement in his condition brought her renewed determination. She whispered quietly, "You're doing well. Keep fighting. Morning will come." The man's eyes slowly began to focus, and he attempted to speak. I don't understand. How?" His voice was weak, but it carried a note of awe. Ahuli smiled faintly. "You don't need to understand," she said. "Just trust me. That's enough for now." She felt a quiet satisfaction in his response. He was alive, he was aware, and he was slowly regaining strength. She knew the night was far from over, but this turning point gave her hope that they would survive until morning. At one moment, a loud gust of wind shook the cave, sending small bits of snow tumbling inside. The stranger flinched, fear flashing in his eyes. Ahuli placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said calmly. "The storm can roar, but inside here you are safe. I am here, and I will not let anything happen to you." He leaned slightly into her touch, comforted by her calm presence. It was a fragile moment, but one that strengthened the bond between them. In that frozen night, trust and courage had become their strongest allies. As dawn approached, the storm began to wane slightly, though snow still fell in a soft, steady rhythm. Ahuli noticed the first faint light creeping into the cave, painting the snow with a pale glow. She felt a flicker of relief, knowing that the worst of the night was behind them. But she remained alert, aware that the stranger was still weak, and that the journey ahead, once they left the cave, would be equally dangerous. For now, though, she allowed herself a small moment to appreciate their survival through the turning point of the night. She continued to tend to him, rubbing his hands, giving him sips of warm water, and adjusting the blanket to retain heat. She could see the strength slowly returning to his body. His shivering decreased, and his breathing became more regular. He attempted to sit upright, testing his strength. Ahuli supported him, careful not to let him overexert himself. She whispered encouragements, praising his progress while reminding him to take small, careful steps. Patience was key. The night had shown her that survival was never about rushing. It was about steady, careful effort. Finally, the man managed to look around the cave, noticing the small fire and the faint light of dawn. He realized he had survived hours in the storm thanks to Ahuli's tireless care. He could feel his body slowly recovering warmth, and his mind began to clear from the fog of exhaustion. For the first time, he felt hope, a feeling that had seemed distant only hours ago. Ahuli noticed the change in him, a subtle but powerful shift in his energy. They had passed the turning point of the night together. Survival, she knew, was now within reach. The storm outside had slowed, but had not completely stopped. Snow still fell, drifting in thick curtains that blurred the mountains beyond the cave. Ahuli could hear the faint howl of the wind through the rocks, a reminder that the wilderness was still dangerous. She knew that leaving the cave too soon could be deadly. The man was recovering, yes, but he was still fragile. His body had endured hours of freezing cold, and even now hypothermia could return if she was not careful. Every moment mattered. Ahuli adjusted the fire again, adding more dry bark to increase the warmth. The flames flickered brightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the cave. She guided the man closer to the center of the fire, careful to avoid burns, and rubbed warmth into his arms and legs. "Keep breathing slowly," she instructed. "Let your body absorb the warmth. Don't fight it, just let it flow through you." He nodded weakly, his teeth chattering at first, but gradually calming as the heat spread through him. For a while he seemed to stabilize, and Ahuli allowed herself a small sigh of relief. But her instincts told her not to relax. She had survived many winters in the mountains, and she knew how easily a small setback could turn into a disaster. Suddenly, the man's body stiffened again, and his lips turned a darker shade of blue. Ahuli's heart clenched. She recognized the signs immediately. His core temperature was dropping, and he was slipping back toward hypothermia. She moved quickly, kneeling beside him and checking his pulse. It was weak but present. She adjusted the blanket around him, tucking it under his arms and legs to trap more warmth. She rubbed his hands and feet vigorously, feeling the blood slowly return. Then, remembering the techniques her grandmother had taught her, she pressed certain points along his wrists, shoulders, and neck. She whispered words of encouragement, telling him to focus, to fight, to stay awake. His eyes flickered open and he looked at her, confusion and fear evident in his gaze. "You're still here?" he murmured. You didn't leave me?" Ahuli smiled faintly. her eyes full of determination. "I will never leave," she said softly. "Not tonight, not ever. We're going to get through this together." Her words carried more than comfort. They carried promise, strength, and a deep connection. The man seemed to understand, even through the fog of exhaustion and cold. He relaxed slightly, allowing her to guide him back into the warmth of the blanket. Hours passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. Ahuli stayed alert, watching his every movement, checking his breathing, adjusting the fire and keeping him warm. She encouraged him to take small sips of water, and slowly he began to respond. His shivering decreased, and the color returned to his lips and cheeks. Each small improvement gave Ahuli renewed energy, though she did not allow herself to celebrate too soon. Survival required patience, and patience was tested more by the long, quiet hours than by sudden dangers. As the night wore on, the man attempted to speak again. I can't believe I'm alive," he whispered. His voice was weak, but it carried awe and gratitude. Ahuli gently shook her head. "You did this," she said. "Your body fought, and you kept going. I just helped guide you. You survived because you never gave up." Her words were meant to empower him, to remind him that even in the harshest conditions, courage and determination could carry a person through. He nodded slowly, tears forming in his eyes as he realized the truth of her words. The storm outside continued its rhythm, but inside the cave, the intensity of the night reached its emotional peak. Ahuli knew that the man's survival depended on both her skill and his willpower. Every action she took now was critical. Adjusting the fire, monitoring his breathing, keeping him hydrated, and ensuring that he stayed conscious. She spoke softly to him, telling stories of her life in the mountains, of the animals she had encountered, and of the lessons her grandmother had taught her. The stories were simple, but they grounded him, kept him present, and gave his mind a focus other than the cold. At one point, the man's eyes fluttered closed. Ahuli's heart skipped a beat. She leaned closer, gently shaking his shoulder and whispering his name. "Ah, stay awake," she said. "I'm right here. You're going to be okay. Don't give up." His eyelids trembled, and he slowly opened his eyes again, a faint but clear recognition returning to his gaze. Relief washed over Ahuli, but she did not let it distract her. She continued her careful ministrations, rubbing warmth into his extremities and ensuring that his breathing remained steady. Time stretched endlessly. The night seemed eternal, each hour a test of endurance, courage, and skill. Ahuli remained vigilant, her eyes never leaving the man, her hands always ready to respond to the smallest sign of distress. The storm outside was a constant reminder of the danger they faced, but inside the cave, a fragile bond had formed. Trust and determination intertwined, creating a powerful force that neither the cold nor exhaustion could break. Finally, as dawn approached, the storm began to weaken. The wind softened, and the snow fell more gently. The first light of day seeped into the cave, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered rocks. Ahuli felt a quiet sense of hope. They had survived the peak of the night together. The man was still weak, but his body had regained enough strength to respond to warmth, hydration, and care. He could now move slightly, sip water without coughing, and breathe steadily. Ahuli watched him carefully, knowing that the hardest part of the night had passed. Yet she continued to tend to him, speaking words of encouragement and reinforcing the small victories they had achieved. "You did well," she said softly. You fought through the cold, and your body is strong again. Just a little more, and morning will bring safety." The man looked at her with gratitude, his eyes reflecting awe and respect. In that moment, the bond between them deepened. They had faced the harshest conditions together, and they had survived. The emotional intensity of the night reached its peak as the man's strength returned just enough for him to sit upright and look around the cave. He realized the enormity of what had happened. The storm, his near-death experience, and Ahuli's tireless care. He felt a mixture of fear, awe, and gratitude. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. Ahuli shook her head gently. You don't need to thank me. Just remember this. Courage, patience, and trust can carry you through even the coldest, darkest nights." Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of experience, wisdom, and survival. Outside, the wind continued to howl softly, but the worst of the storm had passed. The snow had begun to settle, and the mountains glistened in the first light of dawn. Ahuli looked at the man, seeing the transformation from weakness and fear to awareness and hope. The night had tested them both, but together they had overcome the greatest challenge. The climax of the story was not a dramatic battle or a sudden rescue. It was the slow, careful, and courageous effort to survive in a merciless wilderness. Ahuli helped the man to his feet, supporting him as he tested his strength. Each step was tentative, but he followed her guidance, trusting her completely. She knew that leaving the cave was still dangerous, but now they had a chance to move forward. The emotional peak of the night had passed. They had survived the worst together. Every moment of care, every act of courage, every whispered word had brought them to this point. The man's life, once at the mercy of the storm, was now in his own hands, guided by Ahuli's strength and knowledge. By the time the sun fully rose, casting light over the snow-covered mountains, the man could stand steadily on his own. Ahuli remained close, guiding him carefully toward the trail that would eventually lead to safety. The storm had left the world transformed, white, glittering, and cold, but no longer deadly. Together they stepped into the morning, carrying with them the lessons of the night, that courage, knowledge, and care could overcome even the harshest challenges, and that survival was often about more than just strength. It was about heart. The storm had finally passed, leaving the mountains bathed in a pale, silvery light. The air was crisp, cold, and clean, carrying the quiet whisper of the forest. Snowflakes still drifted lazily from the sky, settling gently on the pine branches and covering the rugged rocks with a soft blanket. Ahuli stepped outside the cave, the crunch of snow under her boots echoing softly in the stillness. The world seemed peaceful now, almost magical, but she knew that beauty could hide danger. Winter in these mountains was never entirely safe. Even so, today the danger had passed. The man stood beside her, wrapped in the warm blankets she had shared, his face slowly regaining color and strength. He moved cautiously, testing his legs, which still trembled from exhaustion. Ahuli supported him, holding his arm gently, making sure that he did not fall. "Take your time," she said softly. "The ground is icy and slippery. One wrong step, and you could fall." He nodded, glancing at her with deep gratitude and wonder. He was still weak, but he was alive, and that alone was a triumph. Ahuli led him carefully down the slope from the cave toward a faint trail that she knew would take them to safer ground. The journey was slow. Each step required focus and balance as patches of ice hid beneath the fresh snow. The man struggled at times, shivering and groaning softly with the effort, but Ahuli encouraged him gently. "You've come this far," she said. Every step you take now brings you closer to safety.
Keep going. You can do it.
Her words were calm but firm, guiding him as much as her hands did. As they walked, the man looked around at the mountains with a new awareness. Only hours before, they had seemed like a harsh, unforgiving prison, a place where life could be extinguished in minutes. Now, in the soft morning light, the same mountains seemed alive, protective, and beautiful. The snow sparkled like tiny diamonds, and the trees stood tall and strong against the wind. He realized that the very wilderness that had nearly taken his life had also given him a chance to survive, thanks to Ahuli. Her presence had turned a deadly storm into a story of hope and endurance. The man spoke quietly, his voice still weak but growing stronger. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his eyes meeting hers. You saved my life. I was lost, and I thought I wouldn't make it. Ahuli shook her head gently, brushing a strand of snow-damp hair from his face. You don't need to thank me, she said. I did what anyone would do if they could. You survived because you fought, and because you trusted me. That is enough. Her words were simple, yet full of warmth and wisdom. The man nodded, taking in the truth of her message. As they continued along the trail, Ahuli shared more of her knowledge about the mountains. She explained which trees provided good shelter, how to read tracks in the snow, and how to tell which paths were safe during a storm. The man listened carefully, absorbing every detail. It was as if the lessons she had learned over a lifetime were being passed down to him in these fragile moments. He realized that survival was not just about strength or luck, it was about knowledge, awareness, and respect for the land. Eventually, the trail led them to a small clearing, where the snow was shallower and the wind gentler. Ahuli paused, allowing the man to rest. He sank to the ground, exhausted but smiling faintly. I feel stronger, he said, his voice more confident. I can almost believe I'll make it. Ahuli nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. You will, she said. Every step you take now is a step toward life. Keep moving, and you'll get there. In the distance, they saw signs of human presence, footprints from hikers, a faint trail of smoke from a distant cabin. Hope filled the man's heart as he realized he was no longer alone in the mountains. For the first time in hours, he felt that the danger was behind him. He turned to Ahuli, wanting to express his gratitude again, but words felt too small for the enormity of what had happened. She understood without speaking, her quiet strength conveying the message more powerfully than words ever could. As they continued, the man reflected on the night's events. He remembered the blizzard, the cold, and the fear that had gripped him. He remembered the moments when he had thought he would not survive, when every step seemed impossible. And then he remembered Ahuli, her calm presence, her skill, and her unwavering courage. She had guided him, supported him, and refused to let him give up. She had shown him the power of patience, determination, and compassion. Ahuli noticed his gaze and smiled faintly. You are learning, she said softly. The mountains can teach you many things, but only if you pay attention. You have survived because you listened, because you acted, and because you did not give up. That is something you must always carry with you. He nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words. It was more than a lesson in survival. It was a lesson in life. The final stretch of their journey was quiet. The man's energy had returned enough for him to walk steadily without Ahuli's support, though she remained close. Each step forward felt like a victory, a symbol of their shared endurance. The storm had tested them both, but together they had survived. The mountains, once harsh and threatening, now seemed to reward their effort with quiet beauty. Sunlight reflected off the snow, turning the world into a sparkling white landscape, peaceful and serene. At last, they reached the edge of the forest, where the terrain flattened and a small path led toward a nearby village. The man paused, looking back at the mountains, and then at Ahuli. He realized that the woman who had saved him was more than a guide or a rescuer. She was a guardian of the wilderness, a bridge between the human world and the power of nature. He felt a deep gratitude that words could not fully capture. "You've given me a second chance," he said quietly. "I'll never forget this. I'll never forget you." Ahuli shook her head gently. "Remember the lesson, not just me," she said. "Respect the land, respect life, and never forget that courage comes in quiet, steady actions, not just grand gestures. That is what will keep you alive wherever you go." Her words were simple, but their meaning carried far beyond the mountains. The man nodded, understanding that the lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the village came into view, the man felt a mixture of relief and awe. He had survived a night that could have ended in tragedy, and he had learned something far more valuable than mere survival. He had learned the importance of patience, courage, and trust. He had learned that strength alone was not enough, and that compassion and guidance could be just as powerful. And above all, he had learned that one person's courage could save another's life. Ahuli remained at the edge of the forest, watching him move toward safety. She felt a quiet satisfaction not from heroism, but from knowing she had done what was necessary. She had faced the storm, used her knowledge and skill, and guided a stranger through the deadliest night of winter. Her heart was calm and her mind was at peace. Survival had been achieved, and the mountains had been respected. Before parting ways, the man turned to her once more. "I will never forget what you did for me," he said. "You are more than brave. You are remarkable." Ahuli smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of generations. "Live your life well," she said. "Share what you have learned, and remember the mountains taught you much tonight. That is the greatest way to honor what has happened." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and walked down the path toward the village, feeling stronger, wiser, and grateful. Each step was a reminder of the night he had survived, the storm he had endured, and the woman who had refused to let him give up. Ahuli watched him go, then turned back toward the forest, knowing that life in the mountains would continue as it always had. The snow-covered peaks, the whispering wind, and the quiet beauty of nature awaited her, patient and enduring. As she walked back toward her cabin, Ahuli reflected on the night. She thought of the stranger, of the storm, and of the lessons the mountains had reinforced for her once again. Survival was never about luck alone. It was about preparation, knowledge, courage, patience, and the willingness to act when others might hesitate. It was about heart. And tonight, in the frozen wilderness, she had witnessed the power of all these things working together. The village below was just visible now, and she knew that the man would be safe. Her duty had ended, but the memory of the night would remain with both of them forever. In the mountains, life and death often danced closely, and those who respected the land and acted with courage could survive and even thrive. Ahuli had proven that truth once more, quietly, without fanfare, in the heart of a frozen wilderness. She stepped inside her cabin, the warmth of the fire welcoming her back. Outside, the world was calm and silent, the storm replaced by soft snow and gentle light. Ahuli poured herself a cup of tea, sitting quietly, reflecting on the night's events. She felt tired, yes, but fulfilled. She had faced one of the most dangerous nights she had ever encountered, and she had emerged with life preserved, lessons reinforced and courage proven. The morning stretched on, peaceful and calm,